Games Workshop, Warhammer 40,000, Eldritch Omens. Since the Great Rift tore its way across the void, a meagre scattering of unstable real space corridors formed the only remaining bridges between the sundered halves of the galaxy. Of these, the route known to humanity as the Nachmund Gauntlet is the broadest and most stable. Even here, though, stability is a relative concept. With raging warp storms roiling all about it, the gauntlet expands and it contracts unpredictably. This, in turn, creates tidal zones within which luckless systems and worlds are forever being swallowed up, then spat out once more by the Empyrean. Upon one small tidal world, Death, a war host from the Asuyani craft world of Saim-Hann, met the cruel heretics of the Black Legion in a war for the souls of the dead. Here the sadistic warpsmith Devok, the Unmaker, had raised a bleak fortress amidst the blasted wastes of what had once been a verdant and beautiful world. Aided by his elite warband of Black Legion heretic Astartes, Devok sought to harness the erratic warp tides that battered Death and use them to further his own twisted experiments. Had he chosen a different world, the warpsmith might have been left to his diabolic labours. Yet a crucial component of Devok's plan was the exploitation of a resource unique to Death, and to other exodite worlds like it. This was the planet's world spirit, a psychocrystalline matrix sheathed in spirit-sung wraithbone, and wound about with potent warding runes to preserve the sanctity of the souls within. Here was the last refuge of all those Eldari who had once dwelt upon Death, and which connected them with their ancestors to the heart of the planet itself. To Devok, it was a repository of ghastly energy, a psycho-spiritual reservoir that, if he could only gain access to it without destroying it in the process, would feed his own efforts to create monstrously potent demon engines for the Black Legion to wield in battle. It was this scheme of defilement that drew the ire of Autarch Gaelin, and that brought her bloody vengeance down upon Devok and his followers even as warp storms lashed the benighted world. The Nachmund War. It was in the closing years of Millennium 41 that the Great Rift erupted into being. This ragged chain of warp storms brought galactic disruption on a scale not seen since the nightmarish age of strife. It also tilted the long war between Chaos and the Imperium perilously in the heretics' favour. The sentinel world of Vigilus had long been a bastion of Imperial strength. None on that world knew, however, that the planet's importance was greater than they could have imagined. To the artifice of ancient Xenos, buried technologies entangled Vigilus with the distant planet of Sanguiterra, polarizing both worlds and the void between them with anti-empiric energies. It was thanks to the planet's buried secrets that after the onset of the Great Rift, Vigilus found itself at one end of a semi-stable real space corridor, with faraway Sanguiterra at the other. So was formed the Nachmund Gauntlet. Then came Abaddon the Despoiler. The defenders of Vigilus and its surrounding systems remained unaware of the world's buried secrets, or the role those secrets played in shaping the very galaxy. They believed, instead, if they thought about it at all, that the beneficence of the Emperor held the channel open at their backs. The War Master of Chaos knew the truth. He sought to invade Vigilus in order to destroy, or else seize control of, the key to the Nachmund Gauntlet. Abaddon is an ancient and infinitely cunning warlord, a grand strategist whose greatest plans play out over decades or even centuries. Thus, even as his heaviest blow fell upon Vigilus, he also dispatched dozens of champions of warbands to invest a wider war zone. So long as the gauntlet remained open, it presented unique opportunities to be exploited. However, should matters on Vigilus go awry, Abaddon required contingency plans to ensure his onslaught retained its momentum. Devok the Unmaker and his warband represented one such facet of Abaddon's wider plan. Travelling further than most aboard their Baroque frigate, Gastengor, Devok's command plunged down the throat of the gauntlet itself. They were guided by an ancient star chart, plundered from a rogue trader who had enjoyed occasional dealings with the enigmatic Eldorei. It was this stellar chart that brought the Black Legionaries to the abandoned Exodite world of Death. This planet languished in the Zykathura system, which itself lay upon the liminal boundary where the real space of the gauntlet overlapped with the warp storms beyond. Notes found in the Rogue Trader's Journal compared this region to a rugged stretch of shoreline battered by unprecedented and violent tides. They spoke of pirate bands and benighted populations clinging to existence here, forever in peril of being caught unprepared and engulfed by the onset of hellish warp storms. Yet they spoke also of rich rewards for those courageous enough to take the risk, and of warp-spat treasures waiting to be seized. Devok saw such comparisons for the mean workings of a stunted mortal mind. He desired to harness not only the treasures washed up by the warp tides, but also the incalculable energies of the tides themselves. Already an acclaimed forge master and crafter of demonic war engines, Devok wished to elevate his art to new heights. At the cost of thousands of ragged slaves and cultists, he raised an octagonal fortress near to Death's world spirit. He sheathed the structure in psi baffles, Geller shields and solid flux power fields that would allow those within to ride out each onslaught from not only the warp storms, but also any unnatural abomination they conjured onto the planet's surface. Secure in his fortress, Devok next erected a ring of noctiluous crowns, potent warp-focused devices fashioned from blackstone. These he connected with biomechanical ganglia to create a warp energy siphon he named the Lens Empiric. The unholy energies harvested by this network would form the first part of the warpsmith's schemes, yet to bring his plans to fruition, he needed also to tap into the soul-preserving matrix of Death's world spirit. The psycho-crystalline menhirs and ley grids that formed the world spirit had stood amongst Death's bountiful jungles for millennia, guarded by the world's Exodite clans aboard their saurian riding beasts. It formed the haven into which each of the Eldorei souls was released upon their death. Countless sentience now swirled within it, preserved against the onset of the Great Rift by the planet's last living generation. Those Exodites had sacrificed their own chances at salvation, labouring up to the last moment, even as their world mutated and died around them. Before the warp devoured them, the Exodites had armoured their world spirit with protective runes that would ward off even the most powerful attackers, be they flesh and blood or demonic manifestations. It was the sacrifices of these doomed Exodites that had so far held Devok back from plundering the psychic reservoir within the world spirit. He could not simply smash the structure's physical shell. To do so would only scatter the energies within like mists burning away beneath the rising sun. Yet Devok was absolutely determined to succeed, for he had devised a grotesque use for the defiled energies of the world spirit. The Eldorei are ancient and inherently psychic beings, and even a single such soul burns like a sodium flare within the unreality of the warp. If Devok could siphon these souls into the metallic shells of these demonic engines, using the energies of the Lens Empiric, the Exodite ghosts would be trapped inside, along with the demonic entities that drove the machines. Their subsequent torment would, he believed, supercharge his nightmare war engines and transform them into a mighty gift for his master, Abaddon. Determined to win the War Master's favour, Devok had his followers raid further and further out across the worlds of the Gauntlet, bringing the stream of miserable human slaves to the fortress of Death. Those who proved to bear even the slightest psychic mutation were shackled into the warpsmith's nightmarish engines, and their agonies focused into a brute force assault upon the warding ruins of the world's spirit. Time lurched past, as it does in such warp-tainted areas, and one by one the circles of warding runes were extinguished. At last. Only a single innermost circle of wards remained to resist the Vox attack. Yet even as he stripped away the world spirit's defences, the Wobsmith did not realize that he also allowed the dead spirits within to call out ever clearer for aid. At last, the cries were heard. The Asuryani of Saim-Hann. Asuryani civilization is based upon a system of paths, wherein an Eldari masters a single craft with care and discipline before moving on to the next. It is this system that has aided the craft-whirlers in practicing the restraint needed to avoid the spiritual perils that led to the fall. Amongst such an aesthetic and conservative species, craft-world Saim-Hann has an unusual reputation for hot-blooded wildness. There are those from other craft worlds who view the Wild Rider clans of Saim-Hann as little better than barbarians. Few would question their martial prowess, however. More than one Farsean has been forced to swallow his or her pride and beseech the Wild Riders for aid when danger threatened. Specializing in swift hit-and-run warfare, Saim-Hann's war hosts speed to battle aboard jet bikes and grav tanks. They strike like the cosmic serpent of Eldari myth, which indeed is their craftworld sigil, then vanish again, leaving devastation in their wake. Unlike most craftworlders, the clans of Saim-Hann do not act as a single spacefaring nation. Even their Farseers belong to individual clans, and each clan is free to make its own choice without having to secure the agreement or permission of the others. Each clan is led by a chieftain, who further bears the mantle of autarch. Each of these highly skilled Eldari war leaders has trodden many of the paths of the warrior during their long lives, learning new skills at each of the aspect shrines without ever falling into obsession and becoming trapped in the role of exarch. Those of craftworld Saim-Hann must further approve themselves amidst breakneck jetbike races through the craftworld's rugged savanna domes, and sometimes even in ritual duels that can prove lethal. The Eldari of Saim-Hann are impulsive and individualistic. They are also courageous, adhering to simple and noble principles, eschewing their race's tendency to avoid all but the most necessary peril. They find common cause with the Eldari of the Exodite worlds, the two plain-speaking survivalist cultures finding much to like in one another. For all of this, when the seers of Saim-Hann called a council of clan chieftains and reported the whisperings of the dead, the chieftains around the ritual bonfire looked at one another uneasily, and did not speak up at once. It was strange enough that the ghosts of death were able to cry out across the warp, so that their pleas resonated with Saim-Hann's infinity circuit. Some of the council warned this might be some trick, a trap laid by the servants of She Who Thirsts. Others suggested that the cry might have been borne to them by some peculiarity of the gauntlet itself. The seer's readings had all hinted at a bloody price to be paid for those who ventured to death. No chieftain feared to fight, yet even the warriors of Saim-Hann would not willingly cast away precious Eldari lives for what might be a hollow cause. At last, a figure stepped forward, eyes gleaming hot in the leaping flames, and vowed to walk this bloody road. The Black Legion. The first Space Marines were created thousands of years ago to fight as humanity's champions during the golden age of the Great Crusade. As with so much wrought by humanity, however, many have since fallen into damnation. Now the heretic Astartes are a blight upon the galaxy, a threat not only to mankind, but to all other races as well. Of all the traitor legions and renegade warbands of the heretic Astartes, the Black Legion is undoubtedly the largest, the most coherent, and the most powerful. Their master is Abaddon the Despoiler. He was once the favoured lieutenant of the traitor Primarch Horus, and, like his fallen gene-sire before him, he claims the title of War Master. Abaddon rebuilt the Black Legion from a shattered remnant into a great and powerful horde. Beneath his banner fight many of the greatest warlords of the age, be they post-human warrior kings, conniving Chaos Space Marine sorcerers, or even demonic entities drawn from the depths of the warp to fight in Abaddon's name. Fallen Primarchs accede to his commands. Fresh warbands of turned-out space marines or deserters from other surviving traitor legions bend their knee to the spoiler with every passing day. Most of these supplicants are accepted, providing they swear fealty to Abaddon even above the dark gods they worship, and repaint their armour in Black Legion colours. One of the greatest strengths of the Black Legion is its diversity. Each of the original traitor legions was renowned for a particular style of warfare, and these traits have only become more ingrained by the strange influence of the warp as the millennia have passed. By the 41st millennia, they have become supreme in their chosen style of warfare, but to such a great degree that their strategies, their skills and their desires are wholly coloured by it. The Night Lords, for example, were a legion recruited from murderers and psychopaths, and specialised as terror troops even before their fall. Equally, the Iron Warriors excel in siegecraft, both as attacker or defender. The Word-Bearers are the most diabolically faithful of the heretic Astartes, fanatics obsessed with ritual and sacrifice. The list goes on, but the point remains. Most heretic Astartes warbands leans heavily towards a particular kind of warfare, whereas the Black Legion can count masters of every tactical and strategic specialism amongst its ranks. For his part, Warpsmith the Vok was once a member of the Iron Warriors, as were his band. Drawn to the Black Legion by the lure of power and reward, the Vok impresses the Legion's war leaders with his dark ingenuity and skill as a crafter of diabolic war engines. Thus was he given the opportunity to excel upon death. The Forgeborn. The Vok the Unmaker slew his former master, Lord Jagoth, in a bloody internecine combat that nearly tore his warband apart. The Vok cared nothing for these losses, believing that a necessary winnowing had taken place, and that his remaining followers had been tempered in the forge of civil war. Turning their backs upon the Iron Warriors, the Forgeborn escaped their retribution, making off with several packs of demon engines in the process. Their elite warband was welcomed into the ranks of the Black Legion, with only one caveat: attempt such treachery again, and the Vok and his followers would find themselves dangled by their entrails for the sport of the cacodemons. Dread Prophecy. Autarch Medrael Galen was renowned amongst the clans of Saim-Hann as the Bloodied Fang. Her reputation for daring was well founded upon a record of spectacular victories in jet-bike races, coupled with centuries of military conquests. Won first amongst the aspect shrines, and then later, while commanding her clan's war hosts. Galen was the long-standing chieftain of the clan Vaesir Kursani, whose name translated roughly into Imperial Low Gothic as the Zephyr-born Hunt. They were a clan that existed upon the fringes of Saim-Hann society, keeping their own council and sometimes vanishing from the craft world for years at a time. Always they would return to the world ship with bloodied trophies and rousing tales of battles fought alongside plant-dwelling Exodites, enigmatic Harlequin troops, or bands of rangers. Autarch Galen was well known for maintaining strong ties with many such outlying Eldorei factions. Such bonds meant her clan was never short of aid from these esoteric allies when need arose. In securing such far-flung alliances, however, Autarch Galen had committed to blood bonds with prominent Eldorei leaders outside of the Saim-Hann clans. No right was more sacred to those of her craft world. Breaking a blood bond risked becoming Ble Deoradi, exile, an outcast from their people. A bond had existed between Galen and the leader of Death's Exodites, and while none could have expected her to know of her allies' plight, she was now bound to avenge their deaths. The seers of Saim-Hann took counsel with the Autarch. They delivered words of prophecy, and of dire warning that were for her ears only. Her own clan's farseer, Keth, offered her a small, rune-inscribed race-bone serpent that he drove through the chieftain's earlobe like warrior jewelry. When time and fate aligned, he said, Galen should focus upon this precious shard, and it would show her the way to victory amidst tragedy. By Galen's decree, only half of the Zephyr-born hunt took void ship to Death. She would not risk her entire clan on such an ill-omened mission, nor allow her kin to bear the weight of her blood bond upon their souls. However, Farseer Keth would remain to guard the Vesir Quisani, and to help them select a new chieftain should Galen fail to return. Galen's war host faced many perils, even journeying to Death. Though their small, sleek craft was able to make part of the journey along the extra-dimensional paths of the Webway, that ancient, galaxy-spanning network had been badly damaged by the opening of the Great Rift. Around the gauntlet itself, the Webway was tattered and unreliable. Those spars that remained now played host to perilous entities that the Zephyr-born hunt had to evade or else fight their way past. Once they had exited the Webway into real space, the dangers only grew greater. The liminal zones of the Nachmund Gauntlet were beset by perilous empiric tides, monstrous void predators, and piratical raiding bands. Despite the travails, however, Galen's host did at last reach the Zykathura system and slid into high orbit above Death. Galen was appalled at what had become of the world. What once had been a viridian jewel glinting with myriad waterways was now a bloated crimson orb, like a hemorrhaged eye staring hatefully into space. Entire sectors of the planet's crust had been torn loose by mutative convulsions. These formed striated stone tendrils that drifted lazily into the void and shed asteroid-like masses to join the growing belt of ruin orbiting Death. Worse, the planet was framed by the apocalyptic backdrop of a warp storm. Even Eldari sensors could barely handle the roiling masses of void-born aurora, energistic and organic phenomena, and whirling vortices. Yet the clan's psychic warlocks warned that this endless mass was on the turn. It was rolling inexorably to engulf Death once more. The hunt could strike now, with perhaps days, even hours before the storm descended. Or they could retreat and wait, with no telling when, or even if, the storm would recede again. Prophecy, instinct, and the hot blood of Saim-Hann all offered Galen the same counsel. The Autarch would have preferred to scan Death at length before committing her meager forces, but there was no time. She ordered her bands of rangers to depart at once aboard a sleek atmospheric lander and to take the host's small complement of warlocks with them. Their mission would be to pick off the enemy forces lurking around the world spirit, and then to do all that they could to reignite the psychic runes that warded the site. Galen readied the rest of her force to strike at Vox's fortress, the only other source of power, signatures, and sentient life signs on the planet. The world spirit itself could not be removed from Death. Thus, Galen had instead to erase the hated invaders and their diabolical plans entirely. At the least, the Zephyr-born hunt had to ensure the death of the heretic's leader, and in so doing, end the dread plans about which Death's dead had hinted. In the moment before beginning the attack, Galen wondered whether she should share Keth's words with her warriors, warn them of the significant peril into which they rode. She knew that doing so would be pointless, however. No true son or daughter of Saim-Hann would turn aside from battle once their blood was up. Having seen what the servants of Chaos had done to this once beautiful world, they would all be eager for vengeance, no matter its cost. So resigned, Galen gave the order to commence the attack. The Serpent strikes. The Eldari hoped their swift onslaught would catch their enemies unawares. This was certainly the case around the world spirit, where luckless cultists and captive psychers were clinically eliminated before they could raise the alarm. Yet Warpsmith Devok had many unholy sentinels bent to his will, and not all could be silenced. Upon learning of the Eldari threat, Devok, far from being alarmed, was darkly delighted. Progress at beating down the world spirit's wards had slowed to a crawl since reaching the final circle. Human psychers simply did not provide the power to overcome the Xenos runes, However, if the approaching Eldari were led by one of their vaunted Farseers, then such a mind might prove just the skeleton key Devok required to unlock this final barrier. Unaware of the massacre of his cultists around the world spirit, the Warpsmith concentrated on luring his enemies into a trap. Most of the inbound Xenos could be slain and discarded, but Devok wanted their leader alive. Employing his mechano-heretical law, he forced the machine spirits of his fortress's shields to fluctuate. They appeared now to be failing under the empiric bombardment of the approaching warp storm. He then pulled his forces out of the plaza, at the complex's heart, leaving the Noxalith crowns of the lens empiric seemingly defenseless. As a final taunt, Devok himself remained in the open along with a small bodyguard of Forgeborn, feigning maintenance on a chained-down demonic engine. At first, the glimmering lights of the sky might have been mistaken for meteors skimming Death's atmosphere. By the time they resolved into an onrushing Wild Rider host, the speed of their attack saw them almost on top of the fortress's defences. Devok had not forewarned the cultists manning his ramparts and wall guns, the better to give the impression of being caught unawares. Now, ragged mortals dashed for cover, their paltry scraps of armour providing no protection from the hail of monomolecular shuriken and laser blast raining from above. Pulse laser spat beams through the narrow firing slits of embrasures and blew out the skulls of cultists seeking to load and aim their guns. Coiling and departing like a single airborne serpent, the Zephyrborn hunt wove through the defensive fire of Devok's cultists. Squadrons of jetbikes peeled away from the shoal to streak along fire steps with guns blazing. They mowed down panicked Chaos worshippers in droves before rejoining the host. As the solid flux shielding flickered, the hosts roared as one, a serpent about to strike. Timing their attacks to perfection, they drove into the heart of the complex. Galen's own wave serpent led them, the grav tank skimming low towards Devok and his bodyguard. The hurricane of fire surrounding the Chaos Space Marines, snatching several Forgeborn from their feet in sprays of gore. Devok himself dove beneath the chained demonic engine, using it for cover as he had planned. Yet, as the bound engine shuddered under the deluge of fire, the Warpsmith bellowed the order to spring the trap. Expectations coloured by previous encounters with more cautious Asuyani, Devok had underestimated the fury of the Saim-Hann assault. Now he cursed himself for hubris as he realised that he might be moments away from a fool's death. Hydraulic doors whined open in the flanks of spiked black bastions. Heretic Astarte spilled from within. Armoured holding pens shook as their cage doors rattled upwards and released the demon engines trapped within. Cultists appeared on the ramparts and at embrasures, unleashing a hail of fire down upon the Eldari. For a moment it appeared as though the trap had been sprung too late, that the Zephyrborn hunt would slay their target and sweep back into the skies. Then came the devastating discharge of accumulated warp energies, released from the lens empiric under Devok's command. Disembarked aspect warriors reeled as the shockwave passed over them. Some dropped, clutched their helmeted heads and screamed in agony. Others convulsed as their bodies mutated and their spirit stones shattered with gouts of silver smoke. Hails of bolt rounds and autogun fire soon found those that endured, hurling them back, broken to the tortured earth. Grav tanks wobbled in mid-air, their elegant trajectories degrading as their pilots screamed and shook. Several clipped the ground and cartwheeled into flaming ruin. Others arced up and away, only to slam into the fortress's inner walls or be shot down. The Wild Rider jetbikes were worst hit of all. Their pilots were engulfed by warp flame or gripped by the curse of mutation. Their tight formations collapsed. Travelling at near supersonic velocities, the light attack craft slammed into one another or spiraled madly away to become dying streaks of flame. Still, Autarch Galen pressed on. Shrugging off her disorientation, she sprang from the ramp of her wave serpent before it ploughed nose first into the ground. The Autarch fired a volley of rockets into a Mauler fiend, blowing the demon engine apart. A handful of dire avengers and striking scorpions came with her, the aspect warriors rallying to their leader's flowing back banner. Chaos Space Marines fell before their fury. Another demon engine burst apart under their assault. Then came Devok's Chosen, closing in about the Eldorei like an iron noose. The last of the Wild Riders were blasted from the skies, even as they fired volleys of shuriken into their tormentors. One by one, the aspect warriors around Galen fell, though they took enough Forgeborn with them to earn a song worthy of legend. Galen herself span away from a looming demonic engine and slammed her starglaive through a heretic's helm, only to see the pommel of Devok's hammer racing towards her head. The Autarch dodged aside and cut the legs from under another traitor, only for the Warpsmith's mechatendrils to snake around her limbs and hoist her into the air. A final blow to the faceplate of her helm, and Galen's consciousness fled. On the run. When Galen returned to consciousness, she found herself dangling from chained manacles at the heart of Warpsmith Devok's forge. She watched as her weapons were deposited in a spiked casket by a shambling menial, while the Warpsmith himself circled her with a sneer of disgust. Devok was displeased. Though his trap had worked, he himself had been wounded in the fight, and had lost more of his warband than he would have liked. Even ambushed, the Asuryani had almost overwhelmed him. Now he discovered his prize was not the farce he had hoped for. Of course, a captive Asuryani war leader still had uses. Devok was contemplating these when one of his chosen brought him dire news. The slaughter around the World Spirit had at last been discovered. The Warpsmith was coldly furious. The interfering Xenos might even now be undoing years of painstaking labour. Yet with the leading tendrils of a warp storm coiling inexorably closer, Devok had precious little time to stop them. Even the heretic Astartes would not long survive the storm's fury if caught unsheltered on Death's surface. Ordering the Lens Empiric be recharged, Devok went to muster his elite hunting party. He would strike swiftly. Devok again hoped to seize captive Eldorei psychers who, he reasoned, might have made straight for the world's spirit, while their warriors gave their lives to keep them busy elsewhere. Then he would fall back to his fortress and ride out the storm. Galen was left dangling in the firelit gloom, guarded by a band of surly-looking cultists, and with the Warpsmith's departing threats still ringing in her ears. At once she began, surreptitiously, to look for an escape route. Shame and fury burned within her. Farseer Keth's words had prepared her for what had transpired, but they took none of the sorrow from the sacrifice. Only in death will you know victory. Steep the sole price for slender hope. Into the fire you must plunge, and all be brought to ashes. Only then shall the ghostly dirge be sung, and darker fate be foiled. Listen well to the song, it shall be your final succor. As she recalled the prophecy, Galen realized the wraithbone serpent charm in her ear was glowing. Focusing on it, the Autarch heard a crushing tide of whispering voices rising all around her. Whether through blood sacrifice or thanks to the energies of the approaching warp storm, or perhaps finding a conduit through her grief, the charm had forged a tenuous link between Galen's mind and the world spirit. So began an archaic and confusing exchange, the Autarch attempting to divine sense from the overlapping onslaught of whispering voices, and to make her own thoughts audible to them in return. A human mind would have been driven swiftly mad by the tumult. By comparison, Galen was able to devote a portion of her consciousness to the task, even as she swung into sudden motion, kicking one cultist under the chin and breaking his neck. Galen span, still hanging, to wrap one leg around another cultist's neck and break it before catapulting him away into his shocked fellows. In a single rippling motion, she dislocated the bones of her hands and wrists, as she had learned within the howling Banshee's aspect shrine. Dropping cat-like to the floor, the Autarch snapped her joints smoothly back into place, even as she launched herself at her remaining guards. Their dull human reactions were only now catching up, shock easing its grip on their minds. Gun muzzles swung to bear, mouths yawned in yells of alarm. Galen hit them like a thunderbolt, every kick and punch driven by the fury that burned within. Not one of the cultists landed a blow on her, before the last of them hit the floor dead. Still, the autarch sought to converse with the dead, even as she took up a crude Astartes chainsword from a nearby work shrine and brought it down in a two-handed arc upon the casket's lock-in bolts. The noise, of course, brought more guards. They were unlucky enough to burst through the doorway just in time to receive a volley of rockets from Galen's Reaper launcher. A Black Legionnaire loomed through the smoke and fire, bolter hammering. Galen wove aside from the explosive bolts and hurled her borrowed chainsword. The roaring weapon span end over end to bury itself, teeth churning, into the gap between the heretic's breastplate and his helm. Minutes later, the fully armed and armoured Galen sprinted through the Vox fortress. As she ran, she spoke rapidly into her helm's communicator, reaching out to the rangers and warlocks remaining on Daeth's surface. Even now, the autarch was still struggling to commune with the dead of the world spirit. They sought to warn her of something, this much she had gleaned, but true understanding remained frustratingly elusive. Ahead, poisonous daylight spilled through a portal fashioned into a howling demon's maw. Cultists turned from their guard posts, seeking to bar her path. Galen tore through them without slowing down. Then she was out, sprinting across the blasted ground beyond the fortress, with the fury of the warp storm roiling overhead. At her back, Galen heard brazen horns and the roars of demon engines. The hunt was on. Ahead, she could see flickers of movement amongst the jutting spars of ruined Exodite architect and barbed scrub. Her comrades were rallying to her. Now, if she could just stay ahead of the enemy long enough to decipher the world spirit's warning, then at last she would know how to claim victory and avenge her fallen kin. At last, communion had brought clarity to autarch Galen. She knew what the dead of Daeth sought to warn her of, and how to prevent it. Yet the furious warpsmith had now emerged at the head of the demon engine hunting packs, with his elite warriors at his heels. The battle was not over yet. Autarch Galen understood at last what Warpsmith de Vox sought to do upon Daeth. The knowledge repulsed her as much as it stoked her wrath. If de Vox succeeded in harnessing empiric energy and Eldorei soul stuff to fashion his new generation of demonic engines, and if he took that accursed law to Abaddon, the consequences for the Asuryani would be dire indeed. Already they were a dwindling species. If the heretic Astartes began actively hunting them for their spirit stones, or worse yet, plundering their infinity circuits and world spirits, it could mean the end. To prevent such a nightmare from coming to pass, Galen and her remaining followers agreed that they would willingly commit the same act of self-sacrifice made by the Exodites before them. Somber but determined, Galen ordered her orbiting void craft to hunt down whatever lurking ships the heretics had used to reach this world. After destroying it, they were to flee before the wrath of the storm. Her crew had to bear word of all that had transpired back to Saim-Hann. They at least would escape she who thirsts. Warpsmith de Vox, meanwhile, became increasingly wrathful. He knew the warp storm was almost upon Daeth, but he could not simply flee to Sanctuary without being sure he had eliminated the Xenos threat. Leadership of Chaos Warbands is reserved for the strong and successful. Fail here, and de Vox knew one amongst his chosen would take his life and his warband before the storm's wrath had passed. Thus he pressed on, reaching the world spirit to discover Galen's coven of warlocks still bending their psychic powers upon it. To de Vox's horror, he realized they had reawakened 3 of the spirit's 6 rings of wards and had undone much of his labor in the process. Reason swamped by fury, the Warpsmith cast aside notions of capture and instead fell upon the Asuryani psykers with the full might of his forces. The one-sided battle was over swiftly. Yet no sooner had de Vox claimed victory at the world spirit when a distress call crackled through the Vox distortion of the onrushing warp storm. The Xenos had doubled back, had somehow slipped past the Black Legion rear guard, and were even now assailing his fortress again. Davok ordered his warband back to base with all haste. He was gripped by the fear that the enemy might seize his fortress and raise its shields against him. Certainly, it was what he would do with their positions reversed. He snarled orders through the Vox for the garrison forces to hold the Eldorei back until he arrived to finish them off. How the alien war leader had escaped her manacles, he did not know. Davok vowed there and then that he would not allow his contempt for these Xenos to colour his judgment again. This time, he would crush the alien's skull with his thunderhammer and be sure of the job. With their autarch in the lead, the surviving warriors of Saim-Hann blasted a path into Davok's fortress. The subservient cultists dared not raise the outer shields, lest their master believed that they had tried to shut him out. Instead, they tried to fight the onrushing autarch and her rangers. It was a choice that cost them their lives. Autarch, rangers, and shroud runners alike swept through the fortress's winding corridors and vaulted chambers, the latter bent low over their steeds and riding with incredible skill and inhuman reflexes. For the second time that dreadful day, Autarch Galen led an attack into the central plaza of the fortress complex. There had not yet been time for the heretics to clear away the bodies and wreckage of the first battle, and the sight of the strewn Eldorei dead drove Galen to new heights of anger. She took the emotions and channeled them into speed and clarity, as she led her small force towards the noctilith crowns of the Lens Empiric. The skies boiled overhead, half-seen tendrils and yawning maws writhing amidst crackling storm clouds and atmospheric wildfires. Desperate cultists fired a few half-hearted volleys at the Asuryani before the Rangers' pinpoint shots drove them into panicked retreat. Regaining his fortress at last, Warpsmith Davok burst into the central plaza in time to see precisely what the enemy sought to do. The Eldorei were at work around his empiric lens, and he did not need to be a xenotechnicist to recognize the explosives in their hands. Horror gripped Davok at the thought of the destruction that would be unleashed should the lens be sabotaged. Even if the fortress somehow survived the resultant warp blast, its psi baffles would surely be burned away, its shields blown out like candles. Eldorei and Forgeborn alike would be left helpless before the storm's furious bow wave. With a bellow of fury, Davok loosed his favourite Forge Fiend and goaded his chosen into battle. He would be damned to the deepest pits of the dark gods before he let the Xenos kill them all. Davok, the Unmaker, pounded across the compound at the heart of his fortress. Furious heat burned in his chest, the blazing wrath of a diabolic furnace that turns metal molten and sets flame to flesh. In one hand, Davok clutched his thunderhammer Skullbane. His mechatendrils lashed about him like a brood of furious metal serpents. The Warpsmith charged, and all his remaining followers charged with him. Demon engines gave vent to metallic roars that were almost lost amidst the rumble and shriek of the warp storm breaking overhead. Hand-picked chosen sprinted towards the Eldorei with blades drawn, some already firing bolt shells and plasma blasts that snatched alien warriors off their feet. The Xenos turned to meet the attack. They looked too few, surely, to best Davok in open battle, yet the damage they had already done put the lie to that thought, and the alien explosives clamped to the noctilith crowns of his beloved lens reinforced the point. If those charges shatter the lens, then we all die. That clearly was the alien's intent. The selfless nihilism of it all stoked Davok's anger, his rage. He was a creature of singularly selfish intent. To him, their noble sacrifice seemed almost petulant. If they could not have victory, then they would at least deny it to him. "For the dark gods, tear them asunder!" he roared, Vox amplifying his voice so that it boomed across the compound. "Protect the noctilith crowns!" Davok had just time to register the streaks of fire whipping towards him. Post-human instinct triggered muscle and sinew before his conscious brain even recognized the threat. The Warpsmith hurled himself aside. landing with a crash of armour and rolling ponderously to his feet. Eldritch missile struck home where he had stood a moment earlier. Plasma fire blossomed. Blackened stone rattled from Davok's armour as he accelerated into a run once again. The Eldar autarch ran to meet him. She cast aside her missile launcher as she came. "Out of ammunition," Davok assumed. "We will settle this as the Dark Gods demand." The alien moved with blistering speed. He had seen her fight in this compound once already, and had been impressed despite himself, as she battled outnumbered and outmatched. Now, the autarch had no such disadvantages. Davok knew this would be the fight of his life. Jetbikes screamed overhead, their riders snapping off shots that spun Black Legionaries from their feet. A Maulafeed sprang into the midst of a band of cloaked Eldari, who ducked and wove as the demon engines savaged them with talon and fang. Blasts of ectoplasma roared close overhead, blazing bale stars against the roiling madness of the storm on high. The autarch leapt, spear drawn back for a powerful lunge. Davok roared and swung Skullbane in a meteoric arc, aiming to smash her from the air. His hammer struck nothing. The Xenos spear point halted an inch from his eye as his mechatandriel snatched hold of its haft. Without missing a beat, the autarch used Davok's grip on her own weapon as a fulcrum, pivoting in mid-air to drive one armoured heel into his face. Black stars burst before his eyes. His enemy cartwheeled neatly backwards, ripping her spear from his grasp as she went. Barely had her feet touched the ground when she attacked again. Her spear point jabbed at him once, twice, thrice. Half blinded from her kick, Davok nevertheless wove aside from the first stab while his nest of mechatendrils fended off the second. The third drove white-hot agony into his shoulder, parting bonded ceramite and cursed steel as though it was water. At that moment, though, his enemy left herself open. Skullbane lashed out even as the autarch was ripping her spear from Davok's body. The hammer struck her helm with titanic force, crumpling alloy and shattering one eye lens. The autarch was flung away like a rag doll, rolling over in the dirt as warp lightning exploded overhead. Davok looked up and his lip curled as he realized the storm had them. Ethereal tendrils churned through the heavens, stretching down towards the compound from amidst rolling clusters of colossal eyes. In the same instant, Xenos explosions detonated in a string of blasts that saw one Noctilith crown topple and another collapse in upon itself. Several of his warriors were immolated in the act of attempting to tear the bombs free and hurl them away, their ashes scattered upon the wailing winds. Bellowing hatred, Davok turned back to the fallen autarch. She had torn off her helm and cast it aside, and had risen unsteadily back to her feet. The alien swayed. Her face was a mask of blood. Despite it all, her smile taunted him, feral and knowing. "Too late," it said. "Not too late to finish you," growled Davok. He hefted Skullbane, and, as the nightmare of the warp storm swept down to claim them all, he charged into battle, one last time.